June 17, 1944, Camp Hearn, Texas. The dust rose in golden swirls as the convoy of olive-drab trucks rumbled down the long dirt road toward the gates of the camp. The Texas sun beat down hard, its heat shimmering above the fields that stretched endlessly in every direction. For the women sitting inside the trucks, captured nurses, clerks, and auxiliaries from the German military, the journey felt unreal. The air was heavy with silence. Only the creak of wooden benches and the distant hum of cicadas broke it. Inside the first truck, 24-year-old Lieselot Weber clutched the straps of her satchel, her knuckles pale. She had been a Red Cross nurse attached to a Luftwaffe field hospital in France before Allied forces overran the region. She'd heard the rumors that captured Germans were sent to brutal labor camps in America, beaten, starved, or worse. When the truck slowed, Lieselot craned her neck to see through the slats. Instead of barbed wire and watchtowers, she saw open pastureland, green grass rolling into the horizon, scattered with wooden fences and grazing cattle. A few men on horseback approached, hats shading their faces. Cowboys, she thought. For a moment, confusion flickered across her expression. The convoy stopped at the edge of the camp. The women were ordered out by an American sergeant whose accent was thick and southern. "All right, ladies, welcome to Texas," he called, his voice deep but not unkind. The women stepped down, blinking against the sun. Their uniforms, wrinkled and dusty from days of transport, looked out of place among the boots and denim of the Americans. The cowboys watched curiously, their reins slack in one hand, their horses shifting lazily beneath them. One of them, a young ranch hand named Tom Jenkins, leaned down from his saddle and said quietly to the sergeant, "These are the enemy?" The sergeant shrugged. "Orders say treat 'em fair." "So we will." Lieselot caught fragments of their words, not fully understanding the English but feeling their tone, not contempt, but something like normalcy. That alone was shocking. The gates opened, and instead of barbed wire cages, the women entered a compound of neat wooden barracks surrounded by open fields. There were guards, yes, but their rifles hung loosely, their manner casual. No one shouted. No dogs barked. Later that afternoon, the Texans gathered to watch the newcomers settle in. The women were given clean water, bread, and even coffee, real coffee, not the bitter ersatz they were used to in Europe. When one of the cowboys approached holding a saddle and reins, gesturing toward the corral, the women stepped back, unsure. Tom grinned and motioned to the horses. "Y'all ever ride?" Lieselot hesitated. Back home, she had ridden only once as a child, on a friend's farm. But the cowboy's easy smile disarmed her. She nodded faintly. To everyone's surprise, Tom didn't reach for chains or restraints. Instead, he extended his hand, a silent offer of trust. Within minutes, the camp's quiet broke into laughter and gasps. One by one, the German women, once trembling, uncertain, and terrified, found themselves seated atop horses, guided by Texans who had likely never met a German in their lives. The sun dipped lower, turning the fields amber. The women rode slowly along the fence line, skirts of their field uniforms fluttering in the wind. The Americans watched, leaning on rails, smiling. Lieselot felt the rhythm of the horse beneath her, steady and alive. For the first time since her capture, she breathed deeply, tasting dust and sunlight instead of fear. That night, as she wrote in her diary under the dim light of a single bulb, she scribbled words in disbelief. "They treat us not as prisoners, but as people." The following morning, the camp stirred to life with the sound of roosters and the clang of tin mess trays. The German women awoke to a chorus of unfamiliar noises, the whinny of horses, the drawl of English conversation, and the low hum of a radio broadcasting country music from the guardhouse. For many of them, this was their first sunrise in captivity that didn't feel like a nightmare. Lieselot stood by the window of her small barack, gazing out across the Texas plains, where the mist clung low to the grass. She still couldn't quite believe it. There were no barking guards, no prison dogs, no shouting. The Americans even allowed them to walk freely within the camp boundaries. The propaganda they'd grown up with, the terrifying images of American cruelty, shattered a little more with each passing hour. At breakfast, they sat at long wooden tables, served by army cooks who wore aprons and cracked jokes they couldn't understand. But laughter is universal. One cook winked at Liselott as he handed her a plate of scrambled eggs, toast, and bacon. She looked down at the meal as if it were gold. "So much food," she whispered in disbelief. Back in Germany, rationing had stripped even civilians of meat and butter. Across from her sat Greta Hoffmann, a 28-year-old communications operator who'd once worked in a bunker near Hamburg. She poked at her food, skeptical. "They're trying to make us soft," Greta muttered in German. "That's how the Americans work. Win you over with smiles." Liselott shook her head gently. "Or maybe they just don't hate us as much as we were told." Outside, the camp's American guards chatted casually with a few of the cowboys who had ridden in again from nearby ranches. Word had spread across town, the Germans were women. Curiosity drew everyone, farmhands, shopkeepers, even a few wives of local officers, all wanting to glimpse these supposed enemy women the papers had spoken of. Yet, the meeting was far from hostile. When Tom Jenkins returned to the camp that afternoon, he brought with him a small radio and a pair of old cowboy boots. He held them up with a grin. "Reckon y'all could use something more comfortable than them army shoes." The women laughed, awkwardly at first, then genuinely. Within a few days, the atmosphere of the camp transformed. The Americans began teaching the women simple English words: horse, son, friend. The women, in turn, shared songs from home, slow, melodic German folk tunes that drifted across the barracks at night. For the cowboys, it was surreal. These weren't the monsters the newspapers had described. They were young, many barely older than the local ranchers' daughters. They laughed, blushed, and sometimes cried when letters from home arrived. But there was one moment that sealed the bond between captors and captives. One afternoon, a horse spooked during a riding lesson, rearing violently and throwing its German rider, Anna Muller, to the ground. Gasps erupted as the horse bolted toward the fence. Before anyone could react, Tom sprinted forward, caught the reins, and calmed the animal down. He rushed back to Anna, kneeling beside her. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked, breathless. Anna, shaken but unhurt, stared up at him in disbelief. His voice was filled not with scorn, but concern. In that instant, every word of Nazi propaganda she'd ever believed about American brutality collapsed like a house of cards. That evening, the women gathered around a small fire near the corral. Tom and another cowboy played a harmonica and guitar, while the Germans joined softly in song. Two nations, once sworn enemies, shared the same melody beneath a sky filled with stars. Liselott watched the firelight flicker across faces that had once been hardened by fear. "We were told they were savages," she whispered to Greta. "But look at them. They're human." Greta didn't reply, but the hardness in her eyes softened for the first time. The Texas wind carried their laughter into the night, a sound that, for a moment, made the war feel like a distant echo. By mid-July, life in Camp Hearn had settled into a rhythm that none of the German women could have imagined just a month before. The mornings began not with fear, but with the smell of coffee and the low strum of a cowboy's guitar drifting through the open barracks windows. The women worked light duties, sewing uniforms, tending to the camp garden, and assisting in the small infirmary where Liselott's nursing skills quickly made her indispensable. The Americans treated her with quiet respect. The camp medic, Sergeant William Will Carter, often asked her advice when treating cuts or heat exhaustion. "You got a steady hand, Nurse Weber," he told her once, as she wrapped a soldier's bandaged arm. "Must have seen your share of rough days." She smiled faintly. "Too many." Outside the infirmary, the Texas countryside stretched endlessly, wild and free. The women often looked beyond the fences, not longingly, but curiously. Freedom didn't seem so far away anymore, not when the guard sometimes invited them to walk with them near the fields, under watch but unchained. One afternoon, a small group of local women from the nearby town of Herne visited the camp. They arrived bearing baskets of fruit, cornbread, and jars of homemade preserves. Their leader, Mrs. Margaret Hall, the wife of a ranch owner, approached Liselott with cautious politeness. "We figured y'all might be missin' somethin' sweet," she said softly. Liselott blinked, uncertain how to respond. Then, remembering a phrase she'd learned, she said in halting English, "Danky, very kind." Margaret smiled warmly. "Well, honey, war or not, ladies oughta look out for one another." The German women were stunned. In Germany, American women were painted as immoral, rough, and cruel, yet here they stood, offering kindness to prisoners. The gesture rippled through the camp, changing something deep inside each captive's heart. That evening, the cowboys returned as the sun set, their horses kicking up dust along the trail. Tom dismounted and tossed an apple to one of the women, Helga, who caught it and laughed. "Danky," she called. Tom grinned. "You're gettin' the hang of it." The camp's small riding corral had become the meeting ground for unlikely friendships. The Texans taught the women to ride properly, reins, balance, the rhythm of the saddle. In return, the Germans taught them simple songs from home, clapping and laughing as their American teachers struggled with the unfamiliar words. Over time, Liselott's diary filled with sketches, the outline of a horse, the curve of a cowboy hat, the warm glow of a lantern-lit night. Her entries grew longer, more reflective. "I no longer feel like a prisoner. They speak of honor and freedom, and I begin to understand what those words mean." But outside the fence, the world was still at war. Newspapers arrived with headlines about Allied landings in France, fierce fighting in the Pacific, and the bombing of German cities. Some of the women wept when they read the names of their hometowns. Others stared blankly, unable to imagine what remained of their families. It was then that the Texans' humanity shone brightest. When letters arrived with bad news, they gave the women privacy, quiet, and, sometimes, comfort. One evening, Will Carter found Liselott sitting alone behind the barracks, tears streaking her cheeks. "My brother," she whispered, clutching a folded letter. "He is gone." Will crouched beside her, his hat in his hands. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Real sorry." No words could bridge the chasm of loss, but the silence between them was full of understanding. In the days that followed, the women began helping around local ranches under supervision, repairing fences, picking crops, even caring for horses. The townsfolk, once wary, grew fond of the lady prisoners. Children would wave as the trucks passed, shouting, "Howdy," and the women would laugh and wave back. The lines between enemy and neighbor blurred more with each passing day. And for the first time in a long time, the women realized that even in war, decency could survive, sometimes in the most unexpected corners of the world. By August of 1944, the Texas summer blazed at its fiercest. The air shimmered like liquid glass above the pastures, and the scent of hay and leather lingered everywhere. Inside Camp Herne, the rhythm of life had shifted entirely, from rigid military discipline to something that resembled a small, self-sustaining community. Every morning, the German women lined up for mail call, their hearts tight with hope. Sometimes the letters came, faded, wrinkled pages from mothers or sisters back in a bombed-out Germany. Sometimes they didn't. On those days, silence hung over the mess hall like a heavy cloud. But the Texans had a way of easing even those burdens. After mail call, one of the cowboys would stroll into camp with a harmonica or a deck of cards, ready to spark laughter. Tom Jenkins had become the unofficial bridge between two worlds, the friendly cowboy who spoke slow enough for the Germans to understand, and kind enough to make them forget, if only briefly, that they were prisoners. One afternoon, he arrived with a sack of peaches slung over his shoulder. Figured y'all might like a taste of summer, he said with a grin. The women, suntanned and smiling, gathered around, their curiosity overtaking their shyness. Liselott took a bite, the juice running down her fingers. Sweet, she murmured in broken English. Like, home before war. Tom nodded, wiping his brow. Yeah, ma'am. Guess sweetness ain't one country's alone. That simple exchange, a piece of fruit, a shared smile, said more about humanity than 1,000 speeches ever could. In the evenings, when the work was done and the sun melted into the horizon, the women gathered under the wide Texas sky to talk. Sometimes they shared memories of home, of Christmas markets, alpine meadows, and the smell of baking bread. Other times, they sat quietly, listening to the distant strum of a guitar and the chirp of crickets. It was during one of those evenings that Greta Hoffman, once the most skeptical among them, finally admitted what everyone else had come to feel. I used to believe everything they told us, she said softly, staring at the stars. That Americans were barbarians. That they would make us suffer. But here. I laugh again. I sleep without fear. How can that be? Liselott smiled faintly. Maybe they are not like the ones who started this war. Greta's gaze stayed fixed on the sky. No. Maybe they're what peace looks like. That thought lingered with Liselott long after the others had gone to bed. She lay awake, listening to the distant neighing of horses and the soft whistle of the wind through the fences. For the first time since the war began, she allowed herself to dream, not of escape, but of a world where kindness wasn't bound by uniform or flag. The Americans noticed it too. Captain Robert Langley, the camp commander, wrote in his report to Washington. The German women are cooperative, even cheerful. Local civilians have expressed surprise at their civility. Relations are cordial, almost familial. It seems decency, not force, ensures discipline here. And so it continued. Days bled into weeks. The women learned English words faster, the Texans picked up German phrases, and laughter became the universal language of Camp Hearn. Still, the war loomed. Occasionally, soldiers returning from overseas passed through the camp. Their faces were harder, their eyes older. They looked at the German women with confusion. Weren't these the same people they were fighting? One private, freshly back from Normandy, asked Tom bluntly, "Why you bein' so friendly with 'em? They're the enemy." Tom spat in the dust, then looked toward the corral where Liselott and the others were brushing the horses. "Yeah," he said slowly. "But out here, they're just people." His words hung in the hot air like a quiet rebellion, one that didn't need guns or flags to make its point. That evening, when the stars came out again, Liselott stood by the fence and whispered in German, "Freiheit beginnt im Herzen." Freedom begins in the heart. And in the heart of Texas, that freedom had already begun to take root, in the laughter of enemies who had become friends. By the spring of 1945, the war that had once seemed eternal was finally beginning to crumble. News of Allied advances spread through the camp like wildfire. Rumors of Hitler's collapse, of German cities falling one by one, echoed through the barracks. The women gathered around the camp bulletin board each morning, reading translated dispatches with trembling hands. For many, it was a strange and painful awakening. Home, the place they longed for through every day of captivity, no longer existed as they remembered it. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden were rubble. Families displaced. Husbands and brothers gone. When word reached them in May that the war in Europe was officially over, silence swept the camp. There were no cheers, no celebrations. Just quiet, the stunned, hollow kind that comes when a dream and a nightmare end at the same time. That evening, Liselott sat beneath the corral fence, her diary open in her lap. The horses grazed lazily beyond her, their tails flicking at flies. Tom approached, his hat tipped low, and crouched beside her. "So, it's over," he said quietly. She nodded. "Yes. But now, I don't know what comes next. Tom ran a hand through the red dust at his boots. Reckon none of us do. Not after a thing like this. She looked up at him, her blue eyes weary but soft. We were told Americans would hate us. That we would die in your hands. He gave a small, wry smile. Guess we ain't so good at hatin'. They both laughed, gently, like two people trying not to break the fragile stillness of that moment. In the weeks that followed, the process of repatriation began. Trucks arrived, carrying officials and papers stamped with orders. The German women were to be sent home, or what was left of home. Many of them hesitated. They had come to know the rhythms of Texas life, the open air, the friendly voices, the simple kindness that had become a refuge from the chaos of the world. The day of departure came too soon. The camp gates that had once marked captivity now marked farewell. The women lined up beside the trucks, suitcases and satchels in hand, their faces marked by sun and sorrow. Tom was there, of course, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, trying not to show what he felt. Liselott approached him, her diary tucked under her arm. She hesitated for a moment before holding it out. For you, she said softly. So you remember, we were not enemies. He took it, nodding, his throat tight. I'll remember, ma'am. Always. Then, with the low rumble of the engines, the trucks pulled away down the long dirt road. The women waved through the open slats, their voices carrying faintly over the hum of the tires, "Goodbye, Texas. Goodbye." Tom watched until the last plume of dust vanished beyond the mesquite trees. Then he opened the diary. Inside, on the final page, written in careful English, were the words. They taught us freedom is not about fences. It is about kindness, even to those you once called enemy. Years later, long after the camp had closed and the barracks had been dismantled, people in Hearne still spoke of the lady prisoners, how they'd come as enemies and left as friends. Old cowboys remembered teaching them to ride. Ranch wives remembered baking them pies. And some of the women, once they rebuilt their lives in Germany, sent letters back to Texas, addressed simply. To my friends under the big American sky. Their words, carried across the ocean, were proof of something remarkable, that even in the darkest war humanity ever knew, compassion found a way to survive. And somewhere in a dusty attic in Hearne, Tom Jenkins's grandson would one day open an old leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with time. Inside were drawings of horses, fields, and faces smiling beneath the Texas sun. On the first page, in faded ink, it read.